31,000 feet over West Texas, the first officer came on the cabin speakers and asked everyone seated on the right side of the aircraft to look out their windows. He was trying to sound routine about it and not quite managing, the way a man sounds when he's been handed something out of the ordinary and told to keep it casual. I didn't need to look. I'd felt it already, maybe 8 or 9 seconds earlier, a shudder that came up through the floor and into my shoes, and wasn't turbulence and wasn't engine surge. It was the kind of pressure change you only get when something very fast has gone by very close, and my body recognized it before my head did, the way your body remembers a language you stopped speaking a long time ago. Then they came into view off the wingtip. Two F-22 Raptors, holding formation so cleanly they might have been painted onto the sky. Close enough that I could make out the tail flash, close enough that I could see the shape of a helmet turned toward us in the forward cockpit. The whole cabin came up out of its seats at once, phones lifted over headrests. A kid near the galley started yelling for his mother to come look, and a man across the aisle from me kept insisting they were escorting us, that something had to be wrong with the plane, until a flight attendant put a hand on the seat back and told him gently that nothing was wrong. Nothing at all. And then, together, both fighters rolled a few degrees and dipped their wings. The woman sitting beside me leaned across to the stranger on her other side and asked what that meant. Why would they do that? She was 41 years old. She had my mother's chin and my late husband's stubbornness, and she was my daughter. She was also on an aircraft carrying 162 people, the very last one to understand that the salute outside her window was for the woman sitting 8 inches to her left. To understand how two of the most advanced aircraft in the United States Air Force ended up flying wing on a commercial flight out of Dallas, you'd have to go back 40 minutes. Back to a boarding line at gate C-31, and one sentence my daughter said out loud in front of about 30 strangers, a sentence I still haven't been able to set down. We were headed to Washington. Megan had asked me twice what the trip was about, and twice I'd handed her the same soft, useless answer. Some veterans thing. A ceremony. Nothing worth rearranging her week over. She took it at face value, which was fair, because she'd been taking me at face value for 30 years, and I had never once given her a reason not to. Craig had booked the seats. My granddaughter Ruby, who is 9 and negotiates like a woman twice that, had claimed the window so she could watch the wing. It was Ruby who started it, if I'm being honest. She was watching the ground crew through the terminal glass, and she wanted to know how those men knew where to send an airplane. I told her that everything on that field was talking to the tower and to each other, all day long, and that the whole business runs on people listening carefully to each other. I must have said it with a little too much authority, because a woman ahead of us in line turned around and asked whether I'd worked in aviation. Before I could open my mouth, Megan laughed. Not cruelly. That's the part I keep going back over. It was a light, easy laugh, the kind you use to spare a stranger a longer conversation. Don't get her started, she said. My mom was a stewardess. Coffee and pillows 30 years ago. That's the whole resume. The woman smiled politely and faced front again. The line moved. Ruby was still asking about the tower, and I stood there with the boarding pass in one hand and my bag against my hip. And inside that bag was a letter from the Department of the Air Force addressed to Colonel Evelyn Carter, United States Air Force, retired, informing me that a decision made in 1991 had at last been reviewed, and that in 2 days I would stand in a hall in Washington and be handed something that should have been mine at 36. I didn't say a word. I walked down that jet bridge, sat down next to my daughter, and said nothing at all. If this is the kind of story that gets you, real people and real families and everything we manage to get wrong about each other, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. There's more where this came from, and it helps more than you'd think. My name is Evelyn. I'm 71. I live in a brick house in Dallas with a lemon tree that has never in 11 years produced a single lemon, And for 3 decades, I let my only child believe I poured coffee at 30,000 feet. I had my reasons. A few of them were even good ones. What I hadn't decided yet, what I was still turning over while the cabin door sealed and the safety demonstration started up, was whether I was ever going to tell her the truth, or whether I'd carry it out the same way I'd carried everything else. Row 12. Ruby at the window, Megan in the middle, me on the aisle, and Craig directly across from us with his knees folded up like a man who has apologized to airplanes his entire life. I have a habit I've never been able to break, which is that the moment I sit down on a commercial aircraft, I count the rows to the exit behind me and the rows to the exit ahead. 4 back, 6 forward. I do it without deciding to. Then I look out at the wing, and I check the flap setting, and I listen to the pitch of the auxiliary power unit before they cut it over, and none of that means anything anymore. But my hands still fold themselves in my lap a certain way when the aircraft starts to move, and I couldn't tell you when that started or how to stop. Megan had her laptop out before we pushed back. She runs operations for a hotel group, 11 properties across 3 states, and she is very good at it in the way that leaves marks on a person. Her thumbnail taps the trackpad when she's thinking. Her father used to do the same thing with a pencil against the kitchen table, and I have never once told her that, because there was a stretch of years where telling Megan she resembled her father would have gotten me a look I couldn't survive twice. Ruby, meanwhile, had her forehead against the window and a running list of questions. "Grandma, why is that little truck pushing us backwards?" I told her the airplane can't reverse under its own power, that it can only go forward, so a tug has to shove it out of the gate and point it at the taxiway. She thought about that for a second and said it seemed like a bad design, and I said that it is, in fact, the reason airport gates are laid out the way they are, that the whole airport is built around the fact that a jet can only move one direction on the ground. "How do you know that?" Megan answered before I could. She didn't even look up from the screen. "Grandma knows a lot of airplane trivia," she said. 30 years of hearing it. There it was again. Softer that time. No strangers listening. Just a mother closing a door in a corridor she's been closing doors in for a long time. And I let her, because that's my part in this. And I've played it so long it doesn't require any thought. Ruby went back to the window. Craig caught my eye across the aisle and gave me a small, uncomfortable smile, the kind that says he heard it and didn't know what to do with it either. I want to be fair to my daughter here, because this story goes to a place where it would be easy to make her the villain, and she isn't one. Megan grew up with a mother who was gone. That's the whole of it, really. Between the time she was 2 and the time she was 12, I missed 4 of her birthdays, 2 Christmases, and the entire year she learned to read. She was raised in large part by my mother in a brick house on Ashwood Street in Dallas, with a lemon tree in the back that my mother planted the summer Megan turned 5, and that has never produced a single lemon in all the years since. Megan can tell you which pediatrician she saw and which neighbor drove her to swim practice. She cannot tell you where I was during most of it, because I never told her, and after a while she stopped asking. You have to understand what the world looked like when I started. I was born in 1955 in Wichita Falls, Texas, which is a town that exists mostly because there is an air base attached to it. My father was a mechanic on a small civilian field on the south side, the kind of field with 3 hangars and a windsock and a Coke machine that took dimes. I spent my childhood summers in that hangar handing him wrenches and getting told to move. When I was 11, a crop duster named Hollis Reed let me sit in the front seat of his Stearman while he ran it up, and he put my hands on the stick and moved it a few inches side to side so I could feel the ailerons load up in the wind, and something happened in my chest that has honestly never fully stopped happening. There were no women flying military aircraft then. Not one. It wasn't that it was difficult. It was that the door did not exist. I understood this the way you understand weather. My father, to his credit, never once told me it was impossible. What he said was, Then you'd better be twice as good at everything, because they'll only measure you once. In 1974, I walked into a recruiting office in Fort Worth and told a sergeant I wanted to fly. He was polite about it. He offered me air traffic control, personnel, and finance, in that order. And I took none of them and went to college instead on a scholarship I got by being relentless about paperwork. Then, in 1976, the Air Force opened undergraduate pilot training to women, and I have never in my life filled out a form faster. I was 22 years old when I reported to Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. There were 10 of us, 10 women in the whole program, and about 300 men, and a base that had not been designed with the assumption that any woman would ever need to change out of a flight suit. They put us in a converted supply room. The instructors were split roughly into 3 groups: the ones who wanted us to succeed, the ones who wanted us gone, and the largest group by far, the ones who simply did not want to be the man responsible when we failed. I was not the best stick in that class. I want to be honest about that. There was a woman named Barbara Nyland from Sacramento who could fly formation like she'd been born 18 inches off somebody's wing, and she washed out anyway in the 11th month for reasons that were written down as air sickness and were not air sickness. What I was stubborn and detail-obsessed and physically incapable of being rattled in the cockpit, which turns out to matter more than talent over a 30-year run. I pinned on my wings in September of 1978. My father drove 11 hours to be there and cried in the parking lot afterward where he thought nobody could see him. Back on the airplane, we'd started our taxi, and a flight attendant was coming down the aisle doing the last compliance check. She stopped at our row. She looked at me a beat longer than the job requires, then leaned down. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "are you continuing on to Washington today?" I said I was. She nodded once, like something had been confirmed for her, and said the captain would like to say hello when we reached cruise. Megan didn't look up from her laptop. She said, "She flew for an airline 100 years ago. They always find each other," and kept typing. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap the way they fold themselves, and I thought, very clearly and for the first time in 30 years, this is going to come out today, and I am not going to be the one who chooses how. We came off the runway at Dallas into a hazy sky and turned northeast, and Ruby announced that she could see the highway and that the cars looked like beetles. I told her to watch the wing, that in about a minute the flaps would come up in stages and she'd feel the airplane get quieter and faster at the same time. She watched. It happened. She turned around with her whole face lit up and said, "You knew." "She always knows," Megan said. And there was something almost fond in it that time, and also something tired, and I let it go by. I want to tell you about the 15 years that made me, because you can't understand what happened on that airplane without them. After I pinned on my wings, they sent me to instruct. That's where they sent nearly all of us, because instructing was safe and legal and did not require anyone in Washington to have an uncomfortable conversation. I flew the T-38 Talon at Columbus, Mississippi for 4 years, which means I spent 4 years sitting behind 23-year-old men who had been raised to believe that the day a woman taught them to fly would be the day the world ended. Some of them came apart in the debrief. Some of them requested a different instructor and were told no. And a good number of them, by the end, were the ones defending me in the bar when somebody from another squadron said something, which is a kind of conversion I eventually stopped being surprised by. I met Daniel in 1982 at a barbecue in Tucson that I attended only because a friend threatened to stop speaking to me. He'd been a navigator, had gotten out after 6 years, and was teaching high school physics because he had decided, sincerely and without a trace of bitterness, that he'd rather explain angular momentum to 16-year-olds than be shouted at by a colonel. He asked me what I did. I told him. He said, "Okay," and then asked whether I'd ever flown through the wake of a heavy-on final, because he'd always wanted to know what it actually felt like from the seat. Nobody had ever asked me that. Every man I'd dated for 4 years had either been threatened by the job or delighted by it as a novelty, and Daniel just wanted the technical details, the way you'd ask a carpenter about a joint. We were married 13 months later in his mother's backyard in Waco. Megan was born in the spring of 1985 at 3 in the morning, with a full head of dark hair and a set of lungs you could have used to start an engine. Here is the part I've never known how to say cleanly. I loved that child the way you love the thing that makes you afraid, completely, and with the floor gone out from under you. And I also did not stop flying. Those two facts have lived in the same house in me for 41 years, and they have never once made peace with each other. Daniel carried more of it than any man of that era was expected to. He did the pediatrician and the school forms and the birthday cakes. And when I was on the road, he'd hold the phone against Megan's ear so I could sing to her from a hotel in California. My mother came out from Dallas for months at a stretch. And still, I was gone. Temporary duty, deployments, the endless training rotations, and then in 1989, an assignment to Edwards in the high desert that any pilot in the Air Force would have opened a vein for. Edwards is where they test things. I flew chase, which means that when an experimental aircraft goes up, somebody flies alongside it in a fighter to watch, to call out what the test pilot can't see, to photograph, and to be the last honest voice in his ear if it starts coming apart. I flew chase in F-16s, two-seaters mostly, sometimes the single, which meant that for 4 years, on paper and off it, I was a woman in a fighter cockpit at a time when federal law said women could not fly combat aircraft. The distinction that made it legal was that chase is not combat. That's it. That's the entire difference. Same jet, same speeds, same hands, and one word in a duty description keeping the whole arrangement from turning into a scandal. Everyone at Edwards knew. Nobody above Edwards particularly wanted to. Megan was 4 when we moved to the desert and 8 when we left. She hated it. It's the only stretch of her childhood she remembers in detail, and she remembers it as heat, wind, a house that was never full, and a mother who came home in a flight suit smelling like jet fuel and fell asleep in a chair with her boots still on. She used to draw airplanes with a stick figure inside and a stick figure standing on the ground underneath, and she'd tell me which one was which, without my asking. I told myself she'd understand it later. That's the arithmetic every working parent runs at 2 in the morning, and it isn't exactly a lie, but it is a loan, and it never occurred to me that the interest would come due in front of 30 strangers at Gate C-31. By January of 1991, there was a war on. Most of the men I'd taught to fly were flying missions over Iraq and Kuwait. And I was in a desert in California, watching it on a television bolted to the wall of the squadron bar. I'd like to tell you I was at peace with that. I wasn't. There is a particular shame in spending 15 years preparing for something and then being told, not that you failed at it, but that you were never eligible for it in the first place. Barbara Nyland had washed out for reasons written down as air sickness. I had climbed all the way to the top of the ladder and found a pane of glass over the last rung, and I could see straight through it, and I put my hand flat against it every single day. Daniel brought Megan out to Edwards that February. She was 5, she'd just lost a front tooth, and she would not stop poking the gap with her tongue. She sat on my knee in the officers' club and asked me if I was going to the war. I told her no. She asked why not, and I said because they wouldn't let me, and she thought about that for a second in the solemn, terrifying way children have, and she said, "Because you're a girl?" I said yes. And she said, "That's stupid." I have gone back to that 1,000 times. My daughter was 5 years old, and she took apart the entire architecture of it in 11 words, And 36 years later, she stood in a boarding line and told a stranger her mother served coffee and pillows. On the 6th of March, 1991, I was scheduled for a routine chase flight on a modified airframe out of the North Complex at Edwards. Weather clear, wind out of the southwest at 12 knots, the kind of morning where the mountains look close enough to touch. The test pilot in the lead aircraft was a major named Wes Halloran, 34 years old, 2 kids under 5, and a laugh you could hear from one end of a hangar to the other. 40 minutes into that flight, everything that could go wrong on Wes Halloran's airplane went wrong at once. What I remember first is how ordinary the radio call was. Wes said, "I've got a problem here," in the same voice a man uses when the grocery store is out of the bread he likes, because that's the training. That's what 15 years of it does to your voice. And then, about 4 seconds later, the entire back half of his aircraft went wrong. I was 200 feet off his right wing and slightly aft, which is exactly where you're supposed to be. And from there, I could see everything he couldn't. There was fluid coming out of the fuselage in a sheet. And then there was smoke. And then the airplane started a slow roll to the right that he was fighting and losing. His primary flight controls were going away underneath him. His instruments were lying to him. And the canopy in front of his face had gone opaque along the bottom edge, which meant that the man was, functionally, blind. I moved in closer than the rules allow. I'd like to say I decided to. I don't think I did. For 11 minutes, I flew his airplane for him out loud. That's the only way I know how to describe it. I called his bank angle and his rate of descent and his heading, over and over in a rhythm, left 2 degrees, hold it, you're at 480, nose is coming down, bring it up an inch. I put us on a line for the dry lake bed at Rogers because there is nothing out there but salt flat and open desert for miles in every direction. And because if he had to leave that airplane, I wanted it going somewhere. It couldn't hurt anybody on the ground. The last part I will keep short. His airplane came apart before he could put it down, and he got out, and I stayed until I saw a good canopy over him, and by then I had debris damage down my own left side and was inside the fuel I needed to get home comfortably. I got home uncomfortably instead. Wes Halloran broke a leg and cracked 3 ribs on the lake bed and was found by a rescue helicopter 40 minutes later sitting up in the dirt. And he went home to his 2 kids, and both of those kids are in their 40s now, with children of their own. And there is a man in Sacramento who is alive because of 11 minutes of radio calls in 1991. My squadron commander put me in for the Distinguished Flying Cross. He wrote the recommendation himself, longhand, and showed it to me. And I remember thinking that my father would have to drive 11 hours again. It went up the chain, and it stopped somewhere I never saw. What came back, 5 months later, was a Meritorious Service Medal, which is a fine thing to receive, and is given to people who run good offices. The citation described a chase pilot providing assistance during an in-flight emergency. My name was in it. The 11 minutes were not. Neither was the closure inside 200 feet, nor the fuel state, nor the fact that I put myself in a position that morning that regulations would have prohibited me from being in if anybody had thought to write a regulation about it. A colonel I respected sat me down in an office with a window unit that rattled and told me kindly that this was not about me. Congress was in the middle of arguing about whether women should be allowed in combat aircraft at all. A citation describing a woman flying a fighter 200 feet off a burning airplane over the Mojave was, in his words, a document that would have been read out loud in a hearing room by people looking to win a fight. Somebody upstairs had decided the safest place for that story was nowhere. "Give it 10 years, he said. It'll come back around." I said, "Yes, sir." And I went home and I did not tell Daniel for 3 days. And when I finally did tell him, he set down his fork and said one sentence I've never repeated to anyone. The law changed in 1993. I was 38, which is old for that door to open, and I went through it anyway. I flew fighters operationally for 11 more years. I commanded a squadron. I made colonel in 2001, and I retired in 2005 with a wall's worth of things in a box in a closet in Dallas, and the box has stayed closed because by then keeping quiet had stopped being a decision and become a habit. The way a limp outlives the injury. Now here is how my daughter came to believe I served coffee. She was 12. We'd moved back to Texas. She was at a new school, and desperate the way 12-year-olds are desperate. And there was a thing at the school where parents came to talk about their jobs. She asked me not to wear the uniform. I still remember the exact way she asked, standing in the kitchen doorway with her backpack on, not looking at me, saying it fast so it would be over. So I didn't go at all. A few weeks later, I was picking her up and another mother in the carpool line asked, friendly, what I did. And before I could answer, Megan said, from the back seat, "My mom works for the airlines." And I watched my daughter's shoulders come down. That's the whole thing. That's the entire origin of the lie that ended up in a boarding line 30 years later. My child said something that made her ordinary in front of a stranger, and I saw the relief come off her like heat off a road, and I decided that she had already paid enough for who I was. So I said nothing. I said nothing that afternoon, and I kept saying nothing. And when I took a job in ground operations for a regional carrier after Daniel died in 2011, mostly to have somewhere to be at 7 in the morning, the lanyard and the badge finished the job. By the time Ruby was born, it wasn't even a lie anymore. It was just what everybody knew. We were about 90 minutes out of Dallas when the same flight attendant came back down the aisle. She crouched by my armrest and said there was an open seat forward and that the captain would be glad to have me up there for a while, with his compliments. I said thank you, and that I was fine where I was. Megan closed her laptop. She did it slowly, which was worse. And she looked at me the way she used to look at me across a kitchen table when she was 17. And in a voice pitched so that 3 rows heard it, she said, "Mom, stop." I asked her what she meant. This, all of it. The captain, the special seat, the mysterious ceremony in Washington that you won't explain to anybody. You've been doing this my entire life. You disappear for 30 years and then you show up needing everybody in the room to think there's something more to you. She was not shouting. That's the part I want you to hear. She was quiet and she was precise, and she had clearly been carrying the sentence around long enough for it to get sharp. There isn't. You were never anybody, Mom. You were an old stewardess who was never home. Craig said her name, once, from across the aisle. Ruby had turned all the way around from the window and was looking at her mother with her mouth slightly open. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap the way they fold themselves, and I did not say a single word, because I had spent 34 years teaching that girl exactly this, and I had done it on purpose. And the bill had finally come. Nobody said anything for a while after that. The man in the row ahead of us had gone very still in the way people do when they've heard something they weren't meant to hear and can't unhear it. Craig was staring at the seat back in front of him. Megan opened her laptop again and typed nothing at all. Just sat with her fingers resting on the keys. And I knew that posture too, because it was the posture her father used to take when he'd said something he'd already begun regretting and couldn't figure out how to walk backward. Ruby climbed halfway over her mother's lap to get to me. She put her chin on my forearm and she said quietly, so only I could hear, "Grandma, did you ever get to be in the front of the airplane?" And I said, "Once or twice, sweetheart." That's the answer I gave. After everything. 34 years of practice, and I gave a 9-year-old the smallest true thing I could find and let her go back to her window. I want to tell you what I was actually feeling, because I think people expect it to be rage. And it wasn't. It was something closer to recognition. I had built this. Every quiet year of it. I had let a 12-year-old's convenient sentence stand because it made her shoulders come down, and then I had gone on letting it stand for another 22 years because correcting it would have meant explaining the absences, and explaining the absences would have meant admitting that I chose the airplane over her birthdays more than once, and would probably choose it again. My silence had not protected her. It had just given her a very small mother to be angry at, instead of a complicated one to try to understand. We were about 40 minutes out from the F-22s, though of course I didn't know that yet. What I knew was that the forward cabin door opened and a man in a white shirt with 4 bars on the shoulder came down the aisle, and he was not doing the loose social walk of a captain stretching his legs. He came straight down the aisle looking at row numbers, and he stopped at 12, and he put one hand on the overhead bin, and he looked at me for a second like a man making absolutely sure. Then he straightened up, and he said, in a normal speaking voice that carried 5 rows in every direction, "Colonel Carter, I have not been called that in an airplane cabin in my life. I've been called it in briefing rooms and on flight lines and once at a funeral. Not on a Tuesday morning at 31,000 feet with my granddaughter's elbow in my ribs." I said, "It's just Evelyn now." "No, ma'am," he said. "It isn't." His name was Nathan Ortiz. He was 51 years old, and in 1999 he had been a 24-year-old lieutenant in a squadron I commanded, and I had grounded him for 2 weeks in his first month for a piece of arrogance in the pattern that could have killed somebody. He reminded me of that in front of my daughter. He said it had been the most useful 2 weeks of his professional life, and that he had told the story to every first officer he'd ever flown with. He said, "Ma'am, we've got your name on the manifest and we got a call at dispatch this morning. The wing at Langley is putting up a 2-ship to meet us on the way in. It's for you." They asked if we'd be willing to slow up and give them the geometry, and I told them the airline could take it out of my check. And then, because he had been my lieutenant, and because some things are simply true, he added, "Congratulations on the cross, ma'am. It's about 35 years late." I heard Megan say, "The what?" Ortiz looked at her. He had no idea what he'd walked into. He was a man doing something wonderful with an entirely open face, and he said, "To my daughter, the Distinguished Flying Cross. They reopened the record last year. Your mother flew formation with a burning aircraft over the Mojave in 1991 for 11 minutes so the pilot could find the ground. He's still alive. He's going to be in the room on Thursday." The cabin had gone quiet in that particular way a cabin does, when 160 people are all pretending not to listen at once. The man across the aisle from Craig, 70s, ball cap with a squadron patch on it, took the cap off. Just took it off and held it in his lap. He hadn't said a word this entire flight, and he didn't say one then either. Megan turned to look at me. Her face had lost all of its arrangement. Whatever she'd been holding together for the last 20 minutes was gone, and what was underneath was a 41-year-old woman who had just been handed evidence that the story she'd organized her entire life around was not the story. She said, "Mom." Just that, my name for her whole life, and she said it like a question she didn't have the shape of yet. Ortiz excused himself and went back forward, and a few minutes later, the first officer came over the speakers and asked everybody on the right side of the aircraft to look out their windows. I felt them before I saw them. That shudder up through the floor and into my shoes, the one that isn't turbulence and isn't the engines, and my body knew it before my head did. Then they were there, off the wingtip, holding position so cleanly they looked painted on the sky. 2 F-22 Raptors. Close enough to read the tail flash, close enough to see the shape of a helmet turned toward us. The whole cabin came up out of its seats. Phones went over headrests. A boy near the galley was yelling for his mother to look, and the man across the aisle from Craig was insisting to nobody that they were escorting us, that something must be wrong, until the flight attendant put her hand on the seat back and told him that nothing was wrong, nothing at all. Ruby was screaming with joy and pounding on the window, and both fighters rolled a few degrees together and dipped their wings. Megan asked what that meant. She asked it out loud, to the stranger on her other side, because she couldn't ask me yet. And the stranger, who turned out to be an 81-year-old retired master sergeant from El Paso, told her. "That's a salute, ma'am," he said. "You only get that from another pilot." I unzipped my bag. I took out the letter, the one that had been 6 inches from my daughter's knee since gate C-31, with the seal in the corner and my name on it. Colonel Evelyn Carter, United States Air Force, retired. I put it in her hands, and I said the only thing I had left, which was, "I should have told you when you were 12. I thought I was doing you a kindness." Outside the window, the lead Raptor held its position for another 3 or 4 seconds, steady as a table, and then both of them rolled up and away and were gone into the blue so fast that Ruby made a sound like the air had been taken out of her. Megan didn't look up from the letter. Her hands were shaking. She read it twice, the way I read it when it came, and then she put her fingers over her mouth and she started to cry in front of everybody, which is a thing my daughter has not done in public since she was 9 years old. Thursday came up gray in Washington, one of those low skies that make the marble look like it's holding its breath. They read the citation out loud. That's the part I hadn't prepared for, somehow. A young officer stood at a podium and read the whole of it, the closure inside 200 feet, the 11 minutes, the fuel state on the way home, all the specific things that had been taken out of a piece of paper in 1991 by somebody who thought they were solving a problem. It took 90 seconds to read. I had waited 35 years for 90 seconds. Wes Halloran was in the second row with a cane and a head of white hair and the same laugh, which he used at the wrong moment, the way he always did. He stood up when they said his name. He turned around to face the room and he pointed at me with the cane and said, loud enough for the back, "That one, right there." Megan was in the front row. She'd bought a dress in the hotel lobby that morning because she hadn't packed for anything like this, and she held Ruby's hand through the whole ceremony, and when they pinned it on, she didn't clap right away. She just sat there with her chin up and her eyes running, looking at her mother in a way she has not looked at me since she was small enough to be carried. Afterward, a woman from the historical office told me that the original recommendation had been found in a box of unrelated files by a records clerk who'd been assigned the review as a training exercise. 26 years old. She'd read it, and she'd looked up whether the pilot was still alive, and then she'd walked it to her supervisor and refused to let it go for 11 months. I never got her name. I've thought about that more than I've thought about the medal. We flew home to Dallas on the Saturday, and on Sunday morning, Megan showed up at the house on Ashwood without calling first, which she has never done, and she stood in the hallway and asked me where the box was. It's on the shelf in the closet in the back bedroom, and it hasn't been opened since 2005. She took it down herself. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed the way she used to sit when she was doing homework, and she lifted things out one at a time and made me explain each one. The squadron patch. The photograph of 10 women outside a converted supply room in Arizona in 1977. My father's face in a parking lot in September of 1978, caught by somebody with a cheap camera, red-eyed and grinning like a fool. She held on to the picture of the 10 of us for a long time. She asked which one was Barbara Neeland. Then she asked if she could keep it. And I said yes. And she has it framed now in her hallway in Frisco, where anyone coming through the door has to walk past it. Ruby has decided she's going to fly. She informs us of this about once a week, usually at dinner, usually with her mouth full. Megan doesn't correct her. Megan says, "Okay, then you'll have to be very good at math," and looks at me across the table. And something passes between us that took 34 years and 2 fighter aircraft over West Texas to build. I never got an apology, if you're waiting on one. I don't think I wanted it. What I got was better and stranger. A daughter who started asking questions. She calls on Sunday nights now and she asks about Columbus, about the desert, about her father, about what it felt like the first time somebody put a talon in my hands. She's making up 30 years of not knowing me at a rate of about one phone call a week, and I've decided that's a good pace. If there's anything in this worth carrying out of it, I think it's just that people are almost never as small as the story we've settled on about them. My daughter didn't hurt me because she was cruel. She hurt me because she never had a reason to look, and I never gave her one. Silence doesn't erase what a person was. It just leaves the people who love them holding the wrong picture. So say it out loud, whatever yours is. Don't leave it in a box on a shelf for somebody to find by accident. I've got another one for you, about a man in Savannah who was the only person at his own retirement dinner who didn't know why the room went quiet when the door opened. But that one needs a minute, and it starts in a place you wouldn't expect.